how do you deal with conflict situations at work? And there's many different ways and many different types of conflict situation. But specifically, if you have a member of your team, whether it's a colleague or an employee, a direct report, or even sometimes somebody senior to you in the organisation who is doing things that you don't want them to do. They're doing things in a way that you haven't agreed, or that you explicitly agreed you wouldn't do. Well, you need to be able to tackle these things in the moment, and you need to make sure that your response is exactly that. It's a response, not a reaction. So keep it cool-headed. Make sure that it's unemotional to some degree. Empathetic, emotionally intelligent, but not that you're being ruled by your emotions in your response. And the first time the issue arises, you talk about the issue. You talk about the content of what's happened, and you try to assess, has this arisen as a technical problem? It's something that they can't do, or they just don't have the competency for. And then you ask, if that's the case, you ask yourself the question of, well, what needs to happen in terms of training, coaching to support the person to improve? Or is this a conceptual problem? Is it a won't rather than a can't? In which case you look at the upfront agreement between the two of you and your understanding, your mutual understanding of what expectations are, and also to some extent the mentoring that this person's been given when they first came on board, the acculturation, as in basically how they have learned to be part of this culture. This is the way that we do things round here. If this issue recurs, happens again, then the second time you don't deal directly with the content. Now you start to deal with the fact that there's a pattern, and you talk much more about the fact that it's happened again. The repetition of it speaks to something else going on. It makes it much more likely, by the way, that it's a conceptual problem rather than a technical problem. Or if it is a technical problem and it's a persistent technical problem, then it might actually end up being terminal if you cannot find a way of helping them to overcome that technical difficulty. If it happens again, you're into time number 3 now, you've gone beyond the basic issue, you've gone beyond the pattern that's emerged, and now we're into something much more fundamental. This is either a relationship issue or it's a cultural issue. And the relationship issue is it between the two of you? Is there some disconnect between the two of you that, well, because all relationships are two-sided, you will have your part to play and you will need to own that. You've got to own 100% of your 50% of any relationship between two people. Or is it a cultural issue, which is that the way that we do things around here might be different to the way that we think we do things around here, or that we would like to do things around here? It's certainly true that many organisations have a slightly rose-tinted view of their own culture, that they think this is the way that we behave, they think this is the way that we speak to each other, and they think that these are the artifacts and systems that we use to behave and speak to one another. But actually the reality is somewhat different. And as an exercise that I've done previously, which I borrowed wholesale from one of my mentors a number of years ago, and I've used it so often since that I've basically now appropriated it as being entirely my own. But if you're watching, Roy, thank you very much. It's a very, very good technique. Is to get a group of employees together and to ask them, what are the things that frustrate you consistently about the organisation, about your department, about where you're working? And after some initial hesitancy to share, you'll get somebody in the group who will tentatively stick their hand up and say, oh, I don't really like the fact that the person who delivers the best results actually isn't a very nice person, and they tend to tread on everybody else's toes, but they can get away with it with impunity because their performance is so good. And then somebody else will say, well, I don't really like, there's a bit of politics and backstabbing, and there's another person says, well, I don't like the fact that everybody gets CC'd into emails just to cover people's backsides, and then the floodgates open and they talk about lying and dissembling, and they talk about all these kinds of things that, you know, ultimately are indicative of just day-to-day things that are allowed to slide. And then at the very end of this, when all of these things have slowed to a trickle, I write at the top of the board, this is our culture, because culture is the way we behave around here. It's the way that we speak to each other and so forth. So you get what you tolerate. You also get what you promote. There's a phrase in the military which is that if you set a standard, you see something that's below that standard and you do nothing about it, you've set a new standard. Culture is a lot like that. If you intentionally design a culture and you codify that into behaviours and language, and then you allow things that are opposite to those kinds of intended behaviours and language to flourish, or at least to go unchallenged, well, basically you've created a new culture, and it's not the one that you intentionally designed, it's something different. So when you have these kinds of conflicts, when you have people who are behaving in ways that they, all things being equal, ought not to behave, challenge them appropriately, but also be aware of your own part in this, and to make sure that you are managing with absolute clarity and consistency, and with a level of compassionate candour, which is being open and kind in the way that you speak, but also that you are giving people an absolutely unequivocal understanding of what is expected of them, and what will be celebrated, what will be tolerated, and what won't be tolerated. Where are the red lines? Hopefully that's helpful.